One drop for 50 lines that refuse to fade.
Without fame. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. Stay with me. By the last bell, you will keep your own calendar.
Press play. Let the Basilica teach you how to rest and remember.
My name doesn't matter anymore. It used to. It used to open doors and lower voices and make young seminarians stand a little straighter when I entered a room that smelled like beeswax and stone. Once, I wore the collar and told myself that silence was a sacrament, that a closed mouth could be as holy as clasped hands. Now I understand that silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. It was engineered. And the longer I kept it, the more it sounded like a choir rehearsed to drown out the single human voice that would not sing along. I'm telling you this because a door opened where no door should exist, and because I stepped through it, and because what I saw made all the sentences I grew up trusting feel like they had been clipped and spliced by a hand that never meant for us to notice the seams. I wasn't hunting a mystery that night. I was following a duty roster typed by a bored sacristan who would later swear he never added my name. Inventory. 3 levels below the nave. A task I'd done a dozen times without thinking. Candlesticks, patens, thuribles. The metallic litany of official holiness. I signed the sheet and took the ring of keys, each stamped with letters that had rusted into unreadable prayers. The guard at the iron gate let me pass with a half smile. The kind men give one another when they both wish they were already home. It was raining somewhere above us. Rain. There is always a rumor in the undercroft, a muffled arithmetic tapping out its sums against the city's bones. Down there, the air is older than faith. It wears a chill that never leaves your lungs. The walls are the color of kneecaps. The stones breathe mildew and the sweet fatigue of wax that has burned through too many vigils. If you have never felt a staircase bend under your weight because the wood remembers popes you've only seen in paintings, you can't know the superstition that enters your legs in those corridors. You walk as if history itself were sleeping and you dare not wake it. You count your steps to prove you are still a modern mammal in a rational world. 84, 85, 86. The bulb above the second turn always flickers. The smell, irony and parchment, coats the back of the tongue the way a scab does when you can't stop worrying it with your teeth. The hinges on the known doors complain like honest old men. The one that changed everything didn't. It barely breathed. Imagine a seam drawn through stone with a needle of light. That was all. A thin, vertical wrongness, almost more felt than seen, filigreed in dust as if someone had once pressed a hot brand there and the mark refused to cool. I would have missed it if the bulb hadn't died and forced me to raise my flashlight. The beam found a thickness in the darkness, a place where shadow gathered like water against an invisible shore. I set the inventory clipboard on a crate and backed up, measuring with my feet the way you measure with a childhood fear. 1 pace, 2, 3. The air licked colder. My breath smoked. The silence had a pressure to it, a barometric weight that made the cartilage of my ears ache. We had a legend, told slyly to spook newcomers, about a door that doesn't appear on official maps, a hinge without a frame, a threshold that lets out a sound when touched, not metal on metal, but something like a bell rung underwater. I laughed when I first heard it, because every ancient institution grows a garden of fairy tales to keep children from straying. That night, I reached out and found the hinge with my fingertips before I remembered I was supposed to laugh. It was smooth where everything else was rough, warm where everything else was night cold. A thin residue came away on my skin and smelled like dried iron on parchment. Blood, my mind offered, and then scolded itself for being dramatic. I pressed harder. There was a cough of pressure, like a sealed room figuring out how to breathe again. Somewhere below, or above, or inside the stone, a bell tolled once, not the bronze shout you hear at vespers. The bell you hear when your name is being called from a memory you misfiled. I told myself to walk away. I told myself to fetch the custodian who knew the stories and the switches, but obedience is a habit, and I had practiced it in the wrong direction for too long. I had been trained to obey the church, and without realizing it, I had learned to obey secrets even more. My thumb found the sliver where the stone split like soft bread. The threshold surrendered sumptuously, as if it had been waiting for a human hand. The seam widened a hair, then a hair more until a bass sigh oozed out and touched my face. The passage beyond was not black. It was burdened with a kind of red twilight that made edges grow uncertain and made flat things seem to curve away from you. The flashlight beam fell shorter than it should have, like a tired runner. When a place wants you, it rearranges your common sense first. It makes you talk to yourself as if you were a child in need of a bedtime story that politely lies about the wolves. I told myself it was a storage annex. I told myself the old masonry shifted in damp weather. I told myself a lot of things that felt like formulas we keep for nights like this. My shoe touched a threshold stone worn down to a polish by feet that didn't exist on any ledger. The first step made the skin between my shoulder blades tense, that animal alarm when a hawk passes over a field. The second step made me think of a catechism answer I had memorized at 12 and hadn't thought of in 20 years. The third step made the light above the main corridor click off permanently. I was past the place where sensible men keep their jobs. You will want to know what I saw because you want to know whether it matches what you already fear. That is how control works. It trains your dread to the right shape so you will be grateful for the cage. I saw books chained to iron rails, yes, and the iron stamped with sigils whose meanings were both obvious and withheld. A key threaded through a spinal column, a bell grown out of a crescent moon. I saw a motto burned gilt into the stone over the first lectern, a Latin sentence so proud of itself that even humility couldn't disguise it. Memoria Regit Tempus. Memory rules time. I saw calendars tattooed on vellum with days that did not belong to any year the public keeps, festivals for saints whose names have not adorned any church for 5 lifetimes, leap days, sutured in, where you would never think to look, then unpicked on the next page with a needle made of apology. I saw a ledger that recorded additions to the age, as if time were a coin and you could stack an extra one or shave an edge to pay a debt. I saw initials that stood where signatures should be, and recognized some and understood that the rest were masks constructed to keep you humble in front of a fiction. But before all that, before the nouns that reassure you, this is still a story about objects. I felt something reach back. The corridor had the attention of an animal that doesn't need to hunt because it is the terrain itself. The draught slipped around my ankles and read my bones. It felt like being counted by a bureaucrat whose face you will never see, heard by a choir you will never witness, weighed by a scale that reports only to the hand that owns it. The light from my torch moved across a wall map layered with opacities, a coastline kissing another like a palimpsest of 2 centuries that refused to divorce. Cities shifted a finger-width east, a river threaded differently through a field. It had never irrigated before. At the margin, notes dressed in clerical, italic, paired miracles with ministerial directives, as if cause and effect were simply the right margin of a page, finally shaken into alignment. I remember placing my bare palm on one of the chained covers, not from greed, but from an instinct I can't name. Maybe you'll call it prayer, though the word has been overworked until it limps. The cover was smooth with the patience of hands. Beneath the leather something moved, not the way a trapped animal does, but the way a heart does when it greets a familiar footfall in the hallway. A small heat pulsed under my fingers. The chain gave a polite clink, acknowledging a new equilibrium. The title band was blank. The edges of the pages were gilded with a dulling gold meant to withstand centuries of being looked at and not quite seen. I felt the flap of a torn ribbon. I drew breath. I prepared to open it. A sound stopped me, a reversed syllable, like a tape measure zipping backward, like the end of a hymn being inhaled after someone entangles the scroll. At first, I thought it was my head misfiring in the presence of too much oldness. Then the second reversed syllable came, then a third, and the hair along my arms rose in recognition before my theology caught up. Somewhere deeper, voices were singing a line of chant backward, not as a party trick or an icon of rebellion, but as a craft. Each vowel sucked in where it should have pressed out. Each consonant tucked neatly into the preceding breath. An antiphon for a room that edits while the rest of the world believes it is reading. I should tell you why I kept going. You will judge me less harshly if I pretend courage lit me, or if I say curiosity is a virtue in certain moods. In truth, I kept going because I was close enough now that retreat would have required a lie bigger than the one that brought me here. The corridor's red twilight narrowed into a throat that opened on a small chamber whose proportions were wrong if you were born with eyes like ours. The floor was wider than it should have been. The ceiling leaned inward as if it wanted to drink you. In the middle waited a lectern wearing a pectoral cross of dust. A thin cord threaded from the floor into the lectern's belly, glassy and translucent like a vein. The reversed chant breathed from the right. To the left, the wall map made a slow adjustment that no clock will ever register. A harbor sidled, a border reconsidered itself, a name lost a letter and gained jurisdiction. I opened the book. Of all the things that could have happened, the least theatrical did. No puff of age, no screaming face. The first page held a calendar organized like a legible patience game. Days nested into weeks that belonged to no season. Every seventh entry bore a small red dot in the shape of a bruise. The margins contained the real text. Decisions disguised as footnotes, like the way a careless priest hides his emergency keys under the second statue to the left. Reconcile eclipse with treaty. Read one neat line in a hand that did not tremble. Shift nave dedication by 2 feasts to accommodate transfer of relic custody. Relabel miracle as maritime weather event to resolve dispute. On the next page, someone had written a Latin phrase whose civility chilled me more than any lurid blasphemy. Adiectiones temporum, additions of times. There were 3 columns: proposed, deliberated, enacted. Beside enacted, there were tiny crosses like stitches, closing a wound you will pretend not to see in the mirror. On a narrower shelf lay a register of saints, the ink much newer, the penmanship immaculate. Each name followed by 2 dates. The first was familiar, the feast, the day a community made room for a story. The second was smaller, gray, italic, almost apologetic, abolitio erasure. Some I had never heard, because that's how absence works. Some bled a little as my eyes moved over them, as if the paper were correcting me. No, you do not know. No, you are not permitted to remember. One entry had 3 attempts at the same face sketched lightly in the margin, each scraped with a knife until the paper wore thin. What they couldn't erase, they unlearned. You will think this is theatrical. It isn't. This is administration under the red lamp. It is insurance policy. It is governance, with a sentimental vocabulary. If you came here expecting horns and sulfur, you will be disappointed. If you came here expecting gloves and ink, you will be satisfied. That is the revelation most people never want. Evil can be tidy. A smaller codex, bound in a skin so pale it may once have been the inside of a wrist, lay under a velvet that tried too hard to be humble. I lifted it and found no title, only a thumbprint pressed into the flyleaf like a spiral drawn by a man who didn't have hands. The language on the first page was Latin until it wasn't, the vowels migrating until the familiar grammar had to hold its breath between clauses. I recognized only the shape of the promises, and that was enough to make the skin of my forearms pucker. A commitment to adjust public time to keep private ledgers true. A practice of filing miracles where science would disturb the peace, and filing science where miracles would loosen obedience. A craft for smoothing contradictions by burying the lesser fact until it composted into a mystery of faith. The text did not chant the devil. It chanted custody. There was a moment, the kind that arranges itself to be memorable even while it's happening, when a draft curled in from the hallway and dressed the candle with a second flame. The flame's twin leaned backward instead of forward. I watched it and thought, absurdly, of my father's middle name. I tried to say it under my breath, the way you touch your wallet, to reassure yourself on a crowded bus. It arrived, but it arrived in the wrong key, half a syllable flat. I remember smiling and telling myself not to be dramatic. But afterward, when the stylus moved, it would take me a day and a half to recover that name from the attic of my head. And even then, it would feel like borrowing a neighbor's coat. It fit, but I knew it wasn't mine. From the right-hand corridor, the reversed choir swelled, not loud but committed. I followed the sound through a doorway without a door, past a reliquary whose glass smoked from centuries of candles. The placard did not name a saint. It named a phenomenon. Resonantia, reliquiarum relic resonance. Some engineer had described the way a bone can be tuned to a liturgical frequency, the way an atomic clock keeps time with a metal's vibration. The only difference was language, and language is the most weaponized technology we ever invented. In a side room, 2 women in plain habits and dark aprons ground pigment with powdered ash and murmured simple syllables over a mortar, not incantation but calibration. I asked no one, "What are you brewing?" And the mortar answered me like an aroma. Thesaurus atramentum treasury ink, formulated to bloom on pages never shown, and to fade on those that are framed for public reading. I had the very clear thought that the law I had loved could evaporate when spoken to the poor and condense only when read to the powerful. It was a thought with clean edges, a thought you can live with if you aren't paying attention. I do not know how long I wandered in that red half-light. Time there is lazy, or tame, or tamed. Somewhere above, A tourist lifted a phone to capture a ceiling designed to freeze God into a paintable dome. Somewhere beside me, a map reconsidered a river. Somewhere within me, a clock agreed to be corrected by an older clock whose face I had never seen. When I found the hinge again, it felt like exiting a crowded room into a hallway where your senses mend themselves. The undercroft's honest cold welcomed me back with the relief one feels when a fever breaks. The bulb over the second turn blinked like an exhausted eyelid and then held steady. My inventory clipboard lay where I had placed it, and the coil of the keys had slowly unwound, as if to remind me of a more ordinary craft, a man with a list, counting brass. At the gate, the guard looked up from his paperback. "Everything good, Father?" he asked, using a name that didn't belong to me anymore, though it still flinched like a dog when it hears its old owner's whistle. "All quiet," I said, and found that the words scraped my throat on the way out. He nodded, as if quiet were the answer most men give. I signed the duty sheet and saw, in a dull surprise, too small to even reach my face, that my name had been typed, and then backspaced, and then typed again, the pale ghosts of the first letters still visible, like the false starts of a timid penitent. I lay awake until morning and listened to the city count itself. The rain ended. The bells rehearsed for a wedding somewhere I would never be invited. I put the inventory in the proper drawer. I placed the keys on the correct hook. I folded the duty roster into the file that its label commanded men like me to maintain. I made coffee. I looked at my hands. There was a thin rust of something at the thumb pad I couldn't wash away, silver in certain light, red in others. The smell that rose when soap touched it was the smell that lives where stories are filed and not told. Dried iron on parchment. You want me to say I decided then to become a criminal in the name of truth. That would excuse what comes next for you. It would make a charming thesis for an investigator's documentary voiceover. The truth is worse and smaller. I went back because the door had recognized me. I went back because curiosity can be faithful to the wrong altar for a very long time. I went back because the edits in the world had once been the thing I loved most, the elegant kindness that changes an ugly line into a clean one. I went back because the choir was still singing backward, and I wanted to hear what happened when they finished the phrase. Before I slept, I opened a notebook and wrote 3 sentences, because writing is how you trap fog long enough to walk through it. First, silence is not a sacrament if it protects only the powerful. Second, if memory rules time, then the assault on memory is the oldest liturgy in the world. Third, when a door opens where no door should be, a man is measured by whether he enters alone or returns with witnesses. I closed the notebook. I tried again to say my father's middle name. It came back this time on the first try, though it wore a coat that wasn't his. I lay down. I told myself not to dream in red. Sometime before dawn, my phone vibrated with a message that had no sender, only a subject line that a rational man would blame on a spam filter. Reconciliation, it read, and below it, Adoration Chapel, 2340. Bring gloves. The hour was a private joke with the old clock. The word was not about sin. It was about columns on a ledger. I closed my eyes, and the city's bells rehearsed a progression that I had heard all my life without noticing how obedient it was to the calendar that tells them when to ring. I thought of the hinge without a frame, and the book without a title, and the reservoir that waited like a hollow heart. I thought of the choir and the mortar and the reverse syllables like breath returning to a drowned lung. I thought of the map that moved a harbor, one finger width east, and how, in the movement, an empire remembered itself more comfortably. I did not pray. I counted instead, because numbers behave better for men who doubt. There is a way a day opens, when you know it will ask you to choose between what you were told and what you saw. The light sneaks and does not trust its own hands. The coffee tastes like an alibi. The mirror returns the face of a man you have been rehearsing for so long that you cannot tell whether you are the understudy or the role. I put the notebook in my jacket. I touched the rusting stain on my thumb and decided, without ceremony, that the next time the door breathed, I would be ready to hear it without flinching. I left the room. The city began. Somewhere above us, the rain arranged itself into history. Somewhere below us, an old chamber remembered the shape of my hand. And somewhere this is the part that matters. Something that has always preferred a choir to a single voice. Noticed that one voice had learned a different melody. If you are listening to this in the dark, if your eyes are heavy, and the night has sanded all the sharp edges of your doubt, then hold this small fact with you as you go. Doors like that do not appear to tempt men. They appear to measure them, and when they count you, they count what you remember. That is why the first tool they reach for is the eraser. That is why the first oath they teach is the one that makes your calendar devout. That is why the first chamber you meet is lined with chained books whose pages only deepen their ink when no one is looking. I am not asking you to believe me yet. I am asking you to notice where your own days have been spliced. Notice the hour that will not align with your childhood clock. Notice the map that mocks the river you once swam. Notice the face in the painting whose eyes have been sanded to a blank obedience. Notice how your breath changes when a certain title is spoken aloud. My name doesn't matter, not because I am brave, but because I am late. This is what I can give you for now. The hinge is real. The bell rings from below. The undercroft keeps a twilight that stains your memory, like wine glass rings on a white cloth. Tomorrow night, I will go where the reversed choir lives. I will learn whether the red window appears only during the eclipse, or whether the moon is simply a metaphor for a bureaucracy that requires the world to dim before it edits. I will learn who bleeds into the hollow altar. I will learn how a ledger decides which lives to subtract and which miracles to file as maritime weather. I will return to this recorder with a simpler sentence. One I hope will make you sit up in your bed and watch the shadows on your ceiling compose themselves into something you can explain to no one. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. And once you hear it, you can never again pretend that quiet is peace. Until then, keep your own time. Count not just the hours, but what the hours take. If a door opens where no door should be, do not trust the first story they tell you about what lies beyond. And if you smell dried iron on parchment in a room that is supposed to be empty, understand that you are being invited to choose the calendar you will obey. I will speak again when the ledger teaches me a new word for debt. For now, I will sleep, if the city allows it, with the lights on and the notebook under my hand, and I will practice my father's middle name in the morning sun like a man rehearsing the alphabet after an illness. Names are anchors. Calendars are cages. Choose the one you will carry. And if you think this is only a bedtime story, then let it be a soft alarm set for the hour when a city breathes in before it lies about the weather. When it rings, wake gently. Ask one small question that you were taught not to ask. Then ask a second. That is how hinges rust. That is how memory learns to rule again. That is how a man, even a coward like me, can become a witness without first becoming a hero. I returned the next night with gloves, a cheap pocket recorder hidden in the lining of my coat, and the kind of resolve that feels more like a dare than a virtue. The message reconciliation, 2340, was still on my phone like a fly trapped behind glass. The guard at the gate glanced up and let me pass without comment. I think he recognized the look of a man visiting his own mistake. The key ring weighed the same as it had every other night of my life, which felt like a small betrayal. Weight should respect revelation. The undercroft accepted me with its habitual cold, and I counted the steps because men who fear to be counted often count something else. 84, 85, 86. The bulb over the turn did its exhausted blink, held, and the seam in the wall found my eyes like a clever memory. The hinge did not resist me. It never would again. There is a humility in certain machines that tells you they have already decided your role. I slipped inside, and the red twilight brushed my face with the same apologetic intimacy as last time, as if the corridor were sorry for what it must show me. I switched on the pocket recorder. The tape spun with that domestic purr that has always comforted men who suspect truth needs proof, and proof needs witnesses, even if those witnesses are magnetic oxide wound on a plastic spool. The chained books moved very slightly in their iron cuffs, a quivering I had not noticed before, like horses in a long stable breath when they sense hay being cut across a field. I walked the aisles slowly, reading the spines that did not have titles and the title bands that did not have names. The rails were stamped at intervals with that same motif, a key whose shaft was a spine of vertebrae, a vesper bell fused to a crescent moon, a spiral fingerprint without hands. It is one thing to see symbols. It is another to feel them remembering you. I ran my gloved fingers along the leather of a folio the size of a folded city map. The surface trembled, the way a living thing admits to a flinch. There is a pleasure to opening a forbidden book that no sermon can snuff out. It is the oldest itch in the species, the first fruit reenacted as literature. But the first folio I unclasped was not dramatics. It was a calendar. Rows and columns in a script so neat it could have been printed last Tuesday. At first, it seemed harmless. Saints' days, movable feasts, astronomical notations in a scholar's hand. Then I saw the stitches. 2 Februaries lay against one another like transparent leaves, one with 28 days, one with 29, each annotated in a margin hand. Publicum divided by privatum. Public year, 1740. Private year, 1739, plus 1. 1740. 0.5. I felt the ridiculous urge to laugh. Half years were jokes we told to harass novices, but here were careful instructions that treated days as if they were coins shaved to balance a scale. Insert feria V between feria V and sabbato for purposes of eclipse reconciliation. Publish notice as vigil adjustment due to weather. Reduce candle ration by 1 measure. The handwriting betrayed no sense of drama. Whoever wrote it lived where centuries were tools. I turned the page and encountered a season that had never occurred in the life above. A procession for a saint whose name I could not place Euphemia Secunda with instructions for a hymn I had never seen printed. Udda ara tashent cor audiat. Let the air fall silent. Let the heart hear. The rubric noted, sung backwards in the silent office to avert attention. On the facing margin, in even smaller script, erase upon promulgation of the changed bull. Retain in choir memory. Memory rules time. The motto above the shelf burned in my head like someone had rewired it to be a nerve. I went hunting for something I already feared to find. The register of erasures. It lay in a narrow coffin of a book with low sides, as if the binder had meant to warn the hands about to touch it to be courteous. The ink was newer. The pages smelled faintly of blue gum and metal. Each line paired a name with 2 dates. I whispered a random entry without meaning to, Honorius of Leary, 1,602, divided by Abolicio, 1,752, and felt the inside of my mouth dry as if I had licked copper. The erasure dates were not tiny, apologetic companions. They were deliberate, like a new baptism. One entry had been attempted 3 times in 3 hands. The first 2 scraped away so carefully the paper had thinned to vellum lace. The third stood, Sibylla nomine Mariae, 1,620, divided by Abolicio, 1620 plus 0. Erased the same year she appeared. The margin, glossa, remove from hagiography, retain as internal symbol, archivist's lantern. The constellation rechristened. The sky bent politely. If this had been simply a cruelty of theology, UN canonizes, UN canonizes, again perhaps I would have felt only the old fatigue of doctrinal tides. But the next section opened like the ledger of a shipping firm that trafficked in days. Addiectiones temporum, additions of times, proposed, deliberated, enacted. Each entry linked an event above to an act below to resolve discrepancy in lunar tables versus maritime treaty at Porto Longo, shift harbor map east by 1 finger width, redate Brothers Miracle as meteorological error assigned to adjacent diocese, issue correction in archive only. The hand was daringly legible, as if daring its future reader to accuse it of hiding. A scribe's signature, or what passed for one here, read only C. Beside it, in consistory, unanimous. I thought suddenly of poor scholars upstairs comforting themselves with the notion that error accumulates like dust, and that the future is a patient broom. I wanted to call down into the floor and tell them the truth. Error is a budget line, sweeping is a sacrament, and underneath their feet, someone counts years like tithes. The map hung again at the end of the aisle, not flat but layered, plates of vellum pinned by brass insects. I stood before it and let my peripheral vision do the work, because the map did not like to be looked at head-on. That is the trick with certain animals. You see them better when you pretend you are not. The Mediterranean had suffered a rearrangement small enough to make cartographers argue and big enough to reassign a war. Corsica angled like a blade where it had previously lain like a tongue. A thin, ink-shaded harbor had thickened and brightened, with the self-satisfaction of a correction. Beside it, a note in pale ink. Reconciliatio, 1701 c. Treaty of Sancta Marina. Internal. The word did not mean what it meant. Above. Internal meant real. Public meant explained. The spared. I was dictating softly into the recorder and listening to my own voice sound like a man placing pins in a butterfly, when the reversed chant returned, closer, and the hairs along my arms arranged themselves like soldiers at inspection. I turned toward the sound, which insisted on being not a sound but a grammar in the air, and found a side alcove curtained by what I thought was black velvet until I came very close. It was not a curtain, it was the night itself, trained to hang in a sheet. The choir breathed beyond it. The scent was chalk and hot iron, a sacrament for stonemasons. I was not meant to enter. I entered because I had already entered the larger thing. The room beyond was simple. A table that wasn't a table. It had no top, only a lip around a hollow like the rim of a stone. Well, a stand of carven oak that wore dust like a vestment, and 3 low benches where nothing human now rested. The hollow table, the reservoir, had a glass capillary, the width of a reed running from its base into the floor, where it vanished into the stone like a vein vanishes under skin. I leaned my face close and smelled what I was pretending all week not to name. The glass filament enjoyed a blush it had not possessed the night before. The blush was not metaphor. The choir's backward syllables fanned the blush, the way a bellows fans embers in a smithy. I retreated to the books as a kind of sanity. The next folio did not comply. Where the calendars had been marked in columns and the ledgers ruled like polite chessboards, this book indulged in extravagance that felt obscene. Constellations sprawled across the pages, annotated with ecclesial nicknames that made the child in me want to run around the pews. Virgo had been rebaptized archivist's lantern. As I had already seen, Orion was now outer porter, the belt and sword retitled as the keys and staff of a janitor. I felt the ugly laugh that breaks from a throat when someone opens a joke you weren't meant to hear. In the margin ran a recipe in a half-mocking hand. To open the lantern, intone the archivist's antiphon in retrograde, align the porter's staff with the public hour, extinguish 1 candle for every forgotten syllable. This was no child's squib. Someone had turned sky into latch and scripture into how-to, then filed the how-to under hymnody so the world would mistake its intent. Liturgical acts were engineering investments. The sentence wrote itself in my head and sat there like a stone I could not swallow. Footsteps approached along the main aisle, soft, communal. The sound of people practiced in moving without invitation. I closed the folio, the way a thief closes a wallet in a crowded tram. The choir fell quiet, not because they finished a phrase, but because the phrase had reached an invisible season. A draft that tasted like a prayer that has been emptied of God sighed through the rails. 3 figures passed the mouth of my aisle and continued, not noticing me because the red light, if it is light, takes sides. 2 wore dark aprons over plain habits. Ink alchemists, I thought, remembering the mortar and the murmured syllables. The 3rd wore neither habit nor apron, a man in the regulation black of a bureaucrat who knows the value of uniformity. He carried a stylus in a sheath, the way a swordsman carries steel. They moved toward the map, and I had the idiotic impulse to call out the name of my father's middle name as if it were a counterspell. I swallowed it, like a child swallows a forbidden word in the presence of elders. They stopped before the layered vellum and conferred in low voices that did not hurry. I did not catch their words. I caught the cadence, certainty softened by collegial rhetoric, the comfortable tone of men who have solved harder puzzles than this on less sleep. The man with the stylus lifted it and held it hovering over a thin ink shape. He did not touch the map. He waited the way a priest waits for the organist to find the last chord. Somewhere behind me, the backward choir inhaled. My jaw filled with pressure. A ring closed around my head, as if a distant storm had decided to draw a line through my skull. The stylus touched the vellum and slid east a fraction of an inch. Above us, the world did not lurch or gasp. Only the glass filament in the reservoir blushed a shade deeper. Only my tongue, of all ridiculous instruments, forgot the taste of a childhood fruit and could not recall it correctly for an hour. Only the bones in one of my fingers felt briefly as if they belonged to someone else's hand. Edits must be financed. I understood this as clearly as I had ever understood any theology. The financing was paid in small, unrecorded currencies. Names mislaid, flavors misplaced, streets that no longer quite reached their old corners, a saint's face, whose eyes would startle you if you looked too long, because the painter had painted obedience into the sockets, and then the archive had sanded obedience even smoother. The man with the stylus made a mark next to the harbor, an initial I could not help but recognize now that I had seen it before. C. Unanimous, he said. Or I think he did. The word formed differently in air heavy with reversed music. The ink alchemists produced a narrow flask and touched, with a brush, as fine as a single hair, the amended shore. The amendment bit the pigment with a satisfaction I felt in my teeth. The alchemists turned and left. The man regarded the map lovingly, like a carpenter watching a cabinet accept its last hinge. He did not look holy. He looked content. After they went, I opened the smallest book on the shelf, a volume thicker than a man's palm and bound with ridges like a caterpillar's back. The pages stuck faintly, as if they had been read in humid rooms by men who worried small hours with big opinions. Inside, plain language forced itself to be polite, on the practice of harmonizing public time with providential order, not a writer's text, a manual. It laid out the obvious, as if the obvious had always been shy. Calendars were tools for common life. Common life required predictability. Predictability soothed the poor. Soothing the poor prevented revolt. Preventing revolt saved souls. Everything about the tone invited a reader to agree that every sentence was a gift to the weak. Then, a paragraph that avoided metaphor, the way a surgeon avoids jagged edges. Certain private reckoning is necessary to ensure the integrity of privilege-based custodianship. The faithful require one calendar. The custodians require another. The difference shall be covered with the language of pastoral necessity, privilege-based custodianship. I closed my eyes and felt with savage clarity how expansively those two words could disguise theft. I reached for the recorder and realized my fingers were trembling with a childish unevenness I hadn't known since the first time I held the Eucharist and thought a thought too big for my training. I spoke anyway, quietly. Calendar, double public and private. Chained books with erasures, ledger of editions, map that moves. Choir of reverse antiphons. Reservoir that blushes blood or not blood routed below. Name initial. C. Unanimous. Liturgical engineering. The tape took it. The night kept it. When I looked up, the motto over the shelf did what all mottos do when you finally understand them. It sounded simple enough to be dangerous. Memoria Regit Tempus. Memory rules time. It was not a boast. It was a warning, maybe even a courtesy, for those rare citizens allowed to walk this aisle. If you rule memory by erasing a saint, by renaming a constellation, by laundering a miracle into weather, you rule time, because time is not seconds. It is the stories seconds agree to tell. You want a softer people? Smooth their past. You want a docile city? Rob it of its anniversaries and give it festival days in exchange. You want a world that will not revolt? Teach it to confuse the quiet of edited archives with peace. Something softened in me. Not surrender, not courage. That cheaper, counterfeit, but a coherence that made my spine feel less like an instrument belonging to the institution, and more like an instrument I might yet tune to a human key. The first layer had taught me more than any class that the church I had loved was two bodies, one public with gilded shoulders and one private with a ledger's heart. That liturgy was both devotion and device. That the shepherd's crook is a tool that can move a flock and erase a footpath with equal grace. A sound like a tape click traveled the corridor. The backward choir halted mid-syllable, held silence like a rule, and then exhaled the rest of a line I could not parse. Somewhere beyond the map, a door whispered that careful animal exhale a hinge makes when it remembers to hide. I closed the folio, slid the recorder deeper into my coat, and whispered a promise to a future I could not yet imagine holding. I will not let their quiet teach me to be grateful. On my way out, I paused under the motto and tried an experiment I knew would cost something small. I recited under my breath a prayer I had said 1,000 times, standing in linen in front of candles and faces. I adjusted one word, exchanged a single ever for again. The air changed its temperature as imperceptibly as a lie changes a friendship. The hairs along my wrists listened. Somewhere, a number you cannot see moved one place to the left. My father's middle name stayed. My mother's maiden name flickered and held. Edits must be financed. I could afford that one. They would soon ask for larger payments. Back through the seam, back through the undercroft's honest chill, back past the gate where the guard did not look up, back into the city that believes its clocks are sovereign. I walked along the cobbles, counting the rhythm of the bells, and found that the bells, like every faithful instrument, had been trained not only to count hours, but to affirm an arrangement. Midnight, but a midnight, curated somewhere below, then delivered upward like a gift. I stopped at the mouth of an alley that had never cared for me, and listened to a dog argue with its own shadow. I thought of the harbor that had moved a finger width, and of the fisherman who would never know that a treaty had slid under his boots while he slept. I thought of the erased saint, whose name was now a private lantern used to pick locks in the sky. I thought of the blush in a glass vein. I thought of the ledger's tone, that sweet pastoral velvet covering what the sentence really was. Instruction for theft. Back in my room, I washed my hands and smelled the smell that does not leave, dried iron on parchment. I set the recorder on the table and rewound to the moment I had said, liturgical engineering. The phrase sounded like blasphemy and like math. I wrote in my notebook, the calendar is a weapon when it wears a rosary. The map is a witness that can be coached. A saint is a public poem that, if inconvenient, can be rewritten as an internal tool. Memory rules time. Therefore, memory is the first jurisdiction claimed and the last relinquished. The clock on my wall said a time that agreed with no metaphysics. I lay down and stared at the ceiling until it solved itself into squares. Somewhere under my feet, a choir practiced breathing. Somewhere over my roof, the moon rehearsed its public light. Between the two, in the plain where men are told their names and their duties, I understood the first layer as if it had finally removed its polite veil. They do not merely curate the past for beauty, they configure it for custody. The books are chained not because they threaten to run, but because the men who read them do. Tomorrow, I would go deeper. But tonight, the first layer did what all first layers do. It taught me how the second will hurt. And because I know you are listening in the small hours, and because it matters that you sleep without sleeping through this, let me leave you with the smallest practice the books could not chain. Keep a calendar of your own that no institution can reconcile. Mark not only what happens but what almost did. When something in the world moves a finger width east, and your tongue cannot recall the flavor of a fruit for an hour, write that down. The ledger hates private ledgers. Memory, kept humbly, ruins curated time. I turned off the recorder and the light and waited for sleep like a witness waits for his own courage to arrive. It came late, as it always does. Dressed in a borrowed coat, when it touched my eyes, I saw a hinge without a frame and a motto that a child could understand. Memoria Regit Tempus. I whispered it once more, in my language and in theirs, as if telling a secret to the night that would, for once, keep it instead of filing it away. Then I let the darkness hang like a velvet curtain and tried not to listen for the reversed choir in my dreams. They say the brain learns a building the way a child learns the alphabet, by touch first, then by shape, then by sound. By the third night, my hands already knew where the red twilight thickened and where the air thinned to a papery cool. My eyes had learned which shadows were furniture and which were waiting. My ears had begun to recognize the difference between the breath of stone and the breath of men who make their faces stone. The guard at the gate nodded without looking at my eyes. Men who keep doors for a living learn not to see. It keeps the math tidy. The hinge yielded like etiquette. The corridor received me with that faint apology I had begun to resent. The pocket recorder warmed in my palm. I had started to hold it before switching it on, as if my own heat could persuade it to be braver than I was. I advanced by memory, chained books to the left, the palimpsest map at the aisle's mouth, the reservoir chamber veering right like a heartbeat half hidden behind ribs. Somewhere deeper, the choir practiced its retrograde devotion syllables unwound, with a patient correctness that felt less like piety than like calibration. If language is a ladder into a room called meaning, they were climbing it down. Tonight I meant to follow them, not to witness a rite. Whole, no honest witness ever gets that privilege, but to learn the mechanism of approach, the prepositions of their grammar. Every sacrament, even a counterfeit, rests on choreography. If you learn the footwork, you can sometimes escape the dance. The first threshold was disguised as housekeeping, a rack of extinguished tapers, a crate of linen covers sewn with small white crosses that only a hand could notice, a brass ewer dented precisely where a thumb would brace to tilt. I have known sacristies. I have polished their reliquaries until my face distorted in the curve of a saint's silver shin. This was not that. This was mimicry. Tools wearing cassocks. Implements arranged to reassure an intruder that he was still upstairs. The light corrected this lie. It red-shifted all the brass into the color of old clots. The linen looked funereal, as if the cloth remembered bodies. The ewer's dent shone like a healed wound. Beyond the props, a low door, no lock. Locks are announcements. This had only a thumb scrape where generations of quiet acceptance had polished the wood. I palmed it and felt that old interior cough of pressure. A sealed room deciding whether to inhale. The backward chant was clearer now, 4 voices, maybe 6, rehearsed into an ensemble so unanimous it sounded like a single throat with several lungs. If you have ever heard a choir in perfect unison, you know how it shames individual memory. Your pulse sinks, and your doubt pays tithe. In reverse, a new trick is performed. Your recollection is nibbled at its edges, like mice at paper. The present stays crisp. The past loses adjectives. The room I entered was the silent office, as I had guessed, no windows, a swallow of space shaped to blunt echoes, walls treated with what looked like lime, and what smelled faintly of oil and ink. There was no central altar, only a circled line of slate inlaid with thin brass marks, each a caret pointing inward. On a shelf to the right lay a thin book bound in a leather the color of dried plums. Its spine bore a modest title in a script I had already come to distrust for its firstborn son confidence. Antiphone ad retrorsum, antiphons in reverse. The page was open to a mode I knew by its contour, a mode used in ordinary offices to soothe the city out of its market noise and into its evening hush. But here the neumes had been mirrored about a central axis, their heads on the wrong side of the stem, their tails curled toward the preceding breath. If you sing enough chant, you carry its geography in your bones. Mine revolted, and then, obedient creature that it is, adjusted its internal compass 1 degree at a time until the legibility returned. 6 figures stood at the circle's edge, each with a small lamp turned to face the wall. No one wore a habit. The choir had been stripped of costumes. I read their faces the way thieves read windows, by what they reflected rather than what they showed. The leader, a narrow man with the weary jaw of a lifetime teeth grinder, lifted his hand. The 6 inhaled. The tone began, soft and clean. Sung forward, it means, "The day leans west, let mercy incline with it." Sung backward, it means nothing you can translate and everything you can measure. The air smoothed. A moth that had been scribbling at my peripheral vision landed and stilled, pinned by nothing. The hairs at the nape of my neck lay down like grass under rainfall. My recorder's capstan changed pitch by a hair, as if the tape were quietly choosing the speed it preferred to be believed at. I did not interrupt, not only because fear is clever, but because I recognized the simple truth beneath the spectacle. They were tuning the room. A choir does this, even when it believes itself to be worshiping. Here, the function had been set free from the story. The backward antiphon built an environment where edits would stick. Think of humidity in a paper factory. Think of temperature in an operating theater. Think of controlled static in a clean room where chips are born. We have always understood this. We only pretend not to, because admitting it makes the holy sound like logistics. They had the courage or the indifference to confess the logistics. When the line ended, the leader cut the air with 2 fingers, and the breath went out of the room like a tide. Silence arrived, not as absence but as enactment, a decision pressed into the stone. He nodded to a woman at the shelf. She fetched a tuning fork, not a musician's fork, but a black stem with an inset flask and a scale. She struck it on the slate. The tone was not A. It was something older, a compromise between the ribs and the teeth. The scale's needle rose and settled between marks, labeled not with letters, but with initials I had started to see on ledgers. CRSL, custody. Reconciliation, seal. Liturgia. She recorded the value with a small pencil on a card whose corners had been worn round by thumbs too careful to tear. Room ready, her face said when she glanced at the leader. He didn't smile. He tapped the heel of his right hand twice against his left palm. The group broke formation, leaving their lamps bowed toward the walls like shame. They filed out through a second door I hadn't seen, cut into a seam that had been taught to be inconspicuous. Left alone, I crossed the circle with all the caution of a man wading a river whose stones know his ankles by name. The book on the shelf offered its page without coyness. In the margin, beneath the mirrored neumes, a short rubric in a plain hand, reverse recitation, measurable effects. 1. Suppresses anecdotal recall. 2. Stabilizes ink reactions. 3. Equalizes breath cadence for group decisions. 4. Discourages spontaneous speech. I laughed under my breath, a single disobedient syllable, because the fourth item felt like the minute a meeting begins to go wrong. How many councils in my life had needed a method like this when one conscience threatened to talk? On the facing page, a cross-reference in smaller script. C. Resonantia reliquiarum, thesaurum atramentum, sidera in officio, relic resonance, treasury ink, the stars at the office. I copied the headings in my pocket notebook out of habit. It felt almost comic to pretend that any ink I used would outlast theirs. Then I moved on, following the path the choir had taken, to the room that had smelled like chalk and hot iron since the first night. The ink alchemists had left their mortars to bloom, each pestle resting at a different angle, as if each mixture had its own wintering prayer. Shelves carried ceramic jars with labels in a tinct maker's hand: atramentum publicum, atramentum privatum, atramentum concordatum, and one with no label at all, just a fingerprint in the top layer, as if the jar itself had signed for its delivery. A recipe card stood nailed to the wall. The title was not ashamed of itself: the Sorum Atramentum. Under it, quantities so homely: gum arabic, soot, vinegar, iron filings, that anyone who has ever loved a schoolroom could have made a child's version. Then the line that made my throat tighten: add 1 drop of consecrated solution from reservoir for every 50 lines required to persist, unobserved. Unobserved. A scientific word for what the poor call hidden and what the privileged call internal. Beside the jars, a row of brushes thin as a single hair lay gleaming on a cloth. Each ferrule bore a stamped sigil, a little vesper bell saddled to a moon's crescent, a key threaded along vertebrae. The cloth underneath was stained not with the black we expect from ink, but with a gray that wants to be transparent when you stare at it directly and goes dark when you look away. I tested a jar's rim with my gloved finger. The surface tension broke and mended, as if the ink possessed sleep and wakefulness. In the shallow dish, set apart a saucer with a hairline crack, bridged by a drop that had dried to a glassy scar, I saw the ink do something that no ink should do. It withdrew from the light, not all light, only light from above. I shifted the lamp. The ink relaxed. Someone had taught it to distrust inspection as a category, independent of affection. A book on a stand offered the plainest language of all, the kind that forgets to hide because it believes itself harmless. Public copies must remain legible to the common eye for at least 3 generations. Thereafter, A pastoral note may be issued, correcting transcription errors. Private copies must deepen proportionate to handling by custodian hands. Use absorption schedule B. Below, the absorption schedule, a table modestly insisting on its own efficiency. Touch, deepen, time, darken, air, thicken. My stomach made a small, private fist. There is an intimacy to paper and hand that belongs to love letters and catechisms. They had taught love to collude. I moved on, because horror, to be useful, must be metabolized. The third room along the passage calibrated a different instrument, bones. Here the smell was sweet and powdery, a charnel tenderness ground into order. On a steel tray lay fragments sealed into resin, each labeled not by saint but by frequency. R 57, L 31, C 89. The same initials as the tuning fork's scale. The placard behind the tray refused to mythologize. Resonantia Reliquiarum, a practical guide for liturgical engineers. I wanted to hate the title's vulgarity and found, to my shame, that a part of me appreciated its candor. It stated what the whole undercroft had been doing since men first learned to trade stories for power, turning veneration into geometry. The guide did not linger in piety. It explained that cellular structures respond predictably to certain room conditions, that within a range labeled C, which I had already begun to think of as custody, fewer variables complicated the archivist's labor, that the same fragment left in R reconciliation began to hum at a frequency which made ink soften and maps amenable to gentle correction, that too much L liturgy restored speech to reluctant throats and should be used only on feasts when public devotion must be incentivized. I read that sentence twice and heard behind it a millennium of festivals, transposed up a key to make a tired city dance. At the end of the bone room, a lectern displayed a star chart under glass. Tradition had been retitled, the old names had been smoothed out of the way, and ecclesial nicknames laid atop like gauze. Archivist's lantern burned where Virgo had kept her watch. Outer porter stood where Orion once bragged his belt. The scripter's ladder walked where Cassiopeia once leaned. A strip of vellum running along the chart's base read like a choreography prompt. When lantern at altitude X, begin reverse antiphon IV. Align porter's staff with public hour. Set fork to C between 68-70. Extinguish one candle per absent syllable. You could not ask for a clearer confession. Sky harnessed to a habit. The ancient awe of a face tilted upward, domesticated into a schedule that guaranteed ink would behave. Another note, more personal. The scholar's voice audible through the lattice of official syntax, added, "Do not rush the extinguishing. The room needs to learn the dark in increments or the maps resist." There was almost pity in that last verb. Resistance is a kind of dignity the manuscript tries to remember. The engineers had learned to respect it, the way a hunter respects the deer that nearly gets away. This is where men like the one I had been usually stop and tell themselves they have learned enough to judge. I had not. Knowledge without contact is only posture. I needed to watch a session, if only the approach. The choir's silence had deepened into that cleaned-out void I had witnessed once before. The fork had set the room to C. The bones hummed faint as breath against glass. The ink waited in its jars the way well-trained animals wait at a whistle. The only piece missing was the room with the map, the place where lines become law. I stepped back into the main aisle just as the leader of the choir returned, not with his singers this time, but with two men I had not seen, one gaunt and erect, a long scar disappearing under his collar, the other younger, eyes bright with the zeal that makes cruelty pass. For courage, when a man believes he is performing a service. The older man carried a portfolio, the younger carried nothing, which told me he had been taught he would never have to. They passed me. I lowered my face behind a lampless shadow and made something like a prayer to the architecture. The building obliged. If you spend enough time in cathedrals, you learn they like to help men hide from one another. It keeps the liturgy interesting. At the map, they paused. The gaunt man spread a fresh vellum, no old harbor here, no palimpsest. This was a new layer waiting for first blood. The younger man looked around once, not suspiciously, but with the startled gratitude of a novice invited to the adult table. The choir leader turned his lamp toward the wall and set it down like a man tucking a child to sleep. He raised two fingers and then pointed to the slate line at the aisle's mouth. The signal did not need words. Room is tuned. Proceed. The portfolio produced a document whose seal I recognized in outline, a treaty draft or a concordat, thin with the vanity of words that already imagined themselves engraved somewhere public. The gaunt man did not read it aloud. He traced one paragraph with his stylus and marked in the margin a notation that matched the ledger's neutral cruelty. Effect. Reassign miracle of 1701 to diocese adjacent. Map shift required. Plus 1 finger east. Calendar notice. Weather adjustment. The younger man swallowed, and I felt that swallow in my own throat like a citizen's sympathetic yoke. The stylus came down. The vellum accepted a line the way a coastline accepts a patient tide. No drama, only alteration. The glass capillary in the reservoir blushed, a pulse so slight I would have missed it if I hadn't been teaching myself to attend to blushes. Somewhere, someone's favorite street would no longer meet the square where his grandfather had kissed his grandmother under a rain of petals. Somewhere, a fisherman would find that his permitted waters had changed shape according to a story he would never hear. Somewhere, a name would thin and another would thicken. Somewhere, memory would reach for a fruit and taste the wrong sweetness and shrug, and never know why the shrug felt like treason to an ancestor. The gaunt man added his initial, C. The younger man hesitated. The choir leader did not prod. He merely turned a page on the shelf with his forefinger, exposing the mirrored neumes of another reverse antiphon, as if a man can be dared by a song. The younger signed with a small flourish that made me want, for reasons that have nothing to do with righteousness, to take the stylus from his hand until he learned not to decorate obedience. Unanimous, the gaunt man said. Not the chorus, the record. He rolled the fresh layer and slid it under a brass insect so it could join the centuries. The younger man breathed as if he had swallowed the room's air and was now responsible for metabolizing it. The choir leader nodded. A secular benediction. They left, as they had entered, no hurry, no guilt. A system that pays itself in conscience-free minutes, accumulates centuries without debt. I remained long enough to feel the after-pressure, the fizz in the bones, the faint ache behind the soft palate, the taste of a word I couldn't retrieve. I waited for the adjective to come back into my mouth because I wanted to know what I had spent. It returned late, a shade wrong. I wrote it down in my notebook and circled it twice. Edits must be financed. The phrase had become a drum in my head. Tonight, the payment had been minor. A public sweetness misfiled, a private recollection scuffed. What would the ledger ask when the line to be moved ran through a war? On my way out, I stopped at the antiphone ad retrorsum again and traced one mirrored phrase with a gloved nail, the way a child makes a letter before daring to write it. The ink did not smear treasury. Ink never does when custodians touch it. But something else gave a flake of the page's edge, brittle as old sugar. Beneath the flake lay a paler layer, a ghost of an older script beneath the mirrored neumes. I moved my lamp, careful, coaxing light to behave. The ghost resolved into forward chant, the original devotion whose intervals these engineers had enslaved. For a moment I felt a grief so ordinary it embarrassed me, as if I had caught a friend rehearsing insincerity. Then I folded the grief away like linen and spoke softly into the recorder. They did not invent reverse worship. They reversed worship. The distinction matters. Innovation is proud. Reversal is contempt. At the seam, the hinge waited like a pet that knows the hour. The undercroft's cold returned my breath to me. The gate's guard scratched a note on his pad without raising his eyes. Above, the city had gone to sleep with the flustered dignity of old capitals. I walked streets that believed their angles had been drawn by geology and not by treatied hands. I counted bell strokes and found myself angrier at their perfection than at any canon law. I thought of the room being tuned like a violin under a mechanic's ear. I thought of bones filed by frequency instead of by miracles. I thought of ink that deepens when nobody looks, and I knew I would never again be able to look at a handwritten law without tasting iron. Back in my room, I set the recorder on the table and let it whir a minute longer than necessary, as if letting a child sleep the extra breath she earned by climbing the hill. I washed my hands, and the scent came up once more, dried iron on parchment. I pressed the damp towel to my face and saw, against the cloth's darkness, the mirrored neumes arranging themselves into a message, not to me, but to the stone. Hold. We think speech is for ears. It is also for walls. I wrote one more page in the notebook because I knew sleep would deny me if I left language loose. The choir is a tool. The tool builds a room where edits adhere. Ink is a temperament. They have taught it shyness in public, bravery in private. Bones are metronomes. They set the beat for obedience. The stars are a clock. They have been given jobs as porters and lanterns. All of this is logistics. Logistics investments is what most people call mystery. Somewhere below, the map lay with its fresh correction cooling like a brand, the brass insect holding the vellum in a posture of obedience. Somewhere above, a fisherman slept as his harbor shifted by a finger width. Somewhere within, a word I had loved sank half an inch into silt. I switched off the lamp and said aloud, to keep my mouth in practice for the day I would have to speak where someone disapproved. Silence isn't sacred, it's enforced. The room did not argue. Tomorrow, the corridor would take me to the chamber shaped like an inverted chalice, the place where blood is convinced to be a bureaucrat. For tonight, it was enough to know the prelude, the backward choir, the tuning fork, the bones at sea, the ink instructed to hide, the stars at their clerical posts. The stagehands had shown me their ropes. The curtain would rise on the blood moon oath soon enough. I had told myself that the chamber would be smaller than my fear. Fear likes large rooms. Bureaucracy prefers closets. I was wrong. The room, shaped like an inverted chalice, widened around me as if someone had poured space into a mold and pulled the ceiling tight to a narrowing throat. Stone should not feel vascular, but it did, veins of darker mineral running upward, converging toward a circular aperture engineered to accept only one flavor of light. When the moon reddened, it would drop its color through that wound in the ceiling and stain the room obediently. Until then, a hush pressed from the walls with the sincerity of a librarian's finger. The reservoir sat at the chamber's heart, a hollow altar whose lip had been worn, not by genuflecting devotion but by work. Along its belly, glass capillaries nested like transparent ivy, braided toward a conduit that vanished beneath the floor and, if my guesses were any good, into the nervous system of the archive. No top, no book. This was not a table for reading. This was a throat. They entered without ceremony. Ceremony, here, would have been an admission of theater. There were 9 chairs in a circle, each carved with a keyhole where a coat of arms should have gone. The men who took those chairs wore rings, stamped with the spiral that had appeared again and again in the undercroft, the fingerprint of a hand that believed it had none. The air shifted as their bodies owned it. Leadership is a weather pattern long before it is a vote. The choir leader did not join them. He stood at the periphery, just outside the circle, the way a tuner stands near a piano when the recital proper begins, ready to tighten a string if a note betrays a drift. The moon was not yet wounded. A dull premonition of red threaded the aperture. One of the 9, a man with a nose that had been broken and healed at least twice, unfolded a document in a portfolio and dispensed it page by page without allowing strong feelings to get involved. The pages were thick as bread and smelled faintly of the oils that make hands respectable. The youngest among them, the one I had watched sign earlier, sat 2 chairs to the left of the broken-nosed man. He looked less sure of the gravity tonight, which is not to say he doubted the ethics. Doubt is slower. He was still at the stage where his heart admired the scale of the machinery. "Begin with reconciliation," the broken nose said, "and my mind, which has its own bad reflexes, supplied, of accounts, not of sins." A nod to the choir leader. The backward antiphon commenced in the hall beyond, not loud enough to be a song in this room, but present enough to be a thermostat. A woman's hand, one of the ink alchemists, slid a tuning fork into a notch in the wall and struck it. The needle drifted from L toward C and dozed there, a cat on a sill, an assistant I had not seen. Before gray suit, gray hair, gray life rolled in a small steel trolley, with a tidy array of vials, gauze, a brazier the size of a soup bowl, and a narrow glass funnel that reminded me too much of instruments used in gentler vows. The circular lip of the reservoir had 9 stylized petals, each engraved with a different motto. Not virtues, those had been retired as decor long ago, but operational courtesies: prudenter, recti, ordine, tempori, sine fama, prudently, rightly, in order, in time, without notoriety. I shivered in my coat, and tried to tell myself that the cold was honest and therefore comforting. It didn't stick. "Read," the broken nose said, and a deacon, plain suit, plain voice, plain soul, stepped into the circle with a book whose title was an absence. It was the same volume I had once called the Book Without Title, and it carried its anonymity like a weapon. The text he chose this time was liturgically shaped, not in its rhetoric but in its mechanics. Call, response, promise, seal. The vowels had been taught to climb and then to become silent where expectation wanted music. This is how you tame a human mouth. You attach the pleasure of cadence to the duty of acquiescence. I had prepared my mind for blasphemy. I found something more durable: comfort. The words did not scorch doctrine, they sidestepped it. They were gentle, where a hammer would have confessed too much. To preserve order is to preserve souls. To preserve souls is to protect them from disorder. What protects from disorder is righteous. You can argue with a heresy. You cannot argue with a tautology without sounding disloyal to thought. My skin itched, the way it does when a wool sweater lies about being cotton. The red came then, not the vulgar red of carnival or the sentimental red of martyrdom paintings. It was the old wine red of a library chair where secrets sit comfortably. The aperture drank the moon and fed the room, and the 9 faces arranged themselves into the familial seriousness of men who enjoy their responsibility. No vestments, those would have complicated the brand. Plain jackets, plain rings. The broken nose nodded at the trolley. The assistant approached the first of the 9 with a small needle, a vial, a strip of gauze. No invocation, no coercion. Each hand extended itself with the willingness of a civic duty, and 1 drop of blood winked into the glass funnel and slipped, obedient, down into the reservoir's throat. The capillaries blushed in sequence, waking the conduits like a flock of tiny lamps being coaxed to life across a hillside. I had expected some drama to compensate for the banality. There was none. The backward antiphons scaffolded the air. The bones in the other room hummed at sea. The tuning fork's needle held to its sane compromise. The blood flowed in elegant punctuation marks, commas, in a sentence that did not need exclamation points. If you are waiting for hell to make an entrance, you will always miss the minutes when the world really changes. It changes in accounting language. The deacon read the clause that Maps had already obeyed. Reassign a miracle to an adjacent diocese. Report the correction as a meteorological clarification. Adjust the calendar by an unremarkable vigil day to maintain public mood. Correct the internal ledger in the manner prescribed by pages I had copied with my shaking hand. He moved on. The treaty clause about a port. The funding clause about a museum that would soon display a reliquary emptied of its original bone and filled with a version better suited to the story. The educational clause about new text for students in 2 parishes whose hunger for wonder would be redirected toward a safer feast. If it sounds petty in my retelling, forgive me. These men did not know pettiness. They had persuaded themselves that the smallest edits prevented larger violences, and the part of me that loved cleverness winced because the lie wore the right suit. The youngest hesitated when the assistant offered his gauze. I felt the hesitation like a relief, the way a patient feels the first coolness after fever. The broken nose did not look. He had been taught long ago that looking grants too much reality to reluctance. Instead, he held his pen poised over a margin space on the deacon's page. The youngest bled. The assistant nodded, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. The room's conduits blushed their fraction deeper. The choir leader adjusted his hand in the doorway, and the antiphons' reverse phrasing found a cleaner seam, like a stitch tightened in the back of a garment you will never see. Seal, the broken nose said. The deacon turned the page. The response came not as words, but as gesture. Each man pressed his ring to a small pad of wax-warm resin, and then to the margin. The spiral took. Ownership made its quiet click. I thought, suddenly and savagely, of a child's spiral drawn on a desk when boredom reaches its hour, and how the teacher wipes it with the same disapproval a regime uses on inconvenient faces. The thought passed. The resin cooled. The room learned what had been decided. What was sworn, precisely? You will ask this, because you want a transcript. In a court, you would get one. Here, you are given only choreography and effect. The shapes were clear enough to me to draw in the dark, to adjust public time to match a private providence, to file miracles where science would agitate, and to file science where miracles would loosen a useful obedience, to redistribute faces, names, anniversaries in the way a gardener moves stones to make a path passable. To do all this without notoriety, above all that last motto, sine fama, without fame. If you are tempted to despise them for cowardice, save some contempt for your own hunger to be seen doing good. Vanity has ruined more reforms than malice ever managed. A practical interlude followed, as all vows require. The assistant fed a thread of the collected blood into a small vessel set in the reservoir's belly, and withdrew the rest into vials labeled with initials. This, too, is administration. Never waste a reagent. The blood was not an offering. It was a solvent. It taught the system what to accept and what to reject, whose hands counted toward deepening, whose hands should be denied adhesion. A ledger of touches, a schedule of persistence, a grammar for ink. The deacon closed the book. The backward antiphons ceased not with a cadence but with a cancellation, like breath that sees no point in finishing a sentence when the meaning has already been extracted. The tuning fork's needle drifted a hair toward R and settled. The bones down the corridor rested at their frequency, like monks in the last pew after a vigil. The aperture's red, thinned as a cloud, politely interrupted the moon's charity. Someone coughed. Someone else folded a paper like a train timetable. The youngest rubbed his thumb against the gauze and stared as if waiting to be congratulated by God. God, being older than all of this, offered him the mercy of silence. That might have been the end of the night, and I might have left with a cleaner mind if it had been. But the broken nose man had saved the worst for last because he understood psychology. You train obedience on smaller oaths before you attempt the edit that will demand a greater financing. He lifted a folder wrapped in dull cloth and exposed a vellum whose edges had been kissed by oily hands 100 times. The map it bore did not depict a harbor or a parish. It depicted a year, a wheel of days carefully etched with the old names, the forward chant of time. Across the lower right quadrant, a faint guideline had been drawn. The words in the margin were modest. Adjust vigil to align with harvest tide. Remove minor octave. Add 1 ferial day for internal reconciliation. Promulgate note on practical catechesis. Small? No. This was not a miniature. This was a keystone, disguised as a pebble. The adjustment would not change any feast you could brag about at dinner, but it would move the pressure line on a populace's mood by a finger's width. Schools would conduct their tests half a week earlier. A saint's lesser day would slide unseen. A city's budget for shepherding the poor through the thin month would distort just enough to make a councilman change an argument. An artist would finish a painting under a different weather and choose a marginally darker blue. Do you want history to pivot? Push where men are taught not to count. The deacon waited. The broken nose allowed himself the flattest smile. The youngest glanced at the aperture as if seeking a permission that was not the room's to give. I felt something in my own mouth slip, no word lost this time, not even a name. The loss was stranger. It was more like the little ladder I had built between doubt and action had one rung removed. I gripped the recorder and said nothing because language felt suddenly like a visitor without papers. They signed. The blood thread obeyed. The room, because rooms are older than men, took the oath into itself, the way an old tree takes a nail and continues to grow as if swallowing metal were a mere adaptation. The choir leader lowered his hand and, for the first time since I had met him, looked directly into the circle. His eyes were not cruel, they were administrative. In that gaze, I saw the final theology of the place, which was not hatred of truth or love of lies. It was the idolatry of smoothness. Wrinkles troubled them. They loved a page that lay flat. They loved a city that turned its hours like a clock that has been serviced. They loved a faith that did not alibi the poor with miracles or inconvenience the powerful with science. Every system has a God. Theirs was a perfect ledger. On their way out, the youngest paused by the reservoir and touched the lip with his bandaged thumb. Perhaps he wanted to feel inducted. Perhaps he hoped to feel something bigger than administration. The stone gave him nothing. He obeyed anyway. That is the triumph of such rooms. They make feeling optional. I remained, because staying was my only competence left. After a time, I don't know how long, this room is not generous with clocks. The aperture loosened its red and returned the color to the moon. The conduits cooled. The blood retreated into its hygienic glass. A hush remained, and within that hush the faintest mechanical purr, somewhere under the floor, as the system distributed the night's lessons to the places that would implement them, the ledger tables, the map pins, the choir's part books, the archive's private copies that would accept more ink when certain hands turned their pages. I imagined the city above taxis ferrying drinkers, a nurse standing at a window between pills and prayers, a dog arguing philosophy with a midnight cat, a father waking to feed a child, whose cry ignores calendars, and I wanted to walk out into that ordinary, radiant incoherence and kneel, not to ask for absolution, to confirm that chaos is another word for freedom when the alternative is a timetable that mistakes neatness for mercy. On the chair, nearest me, lay a small note card forgotten under a ring's shadow. I took it because stealing is sometimes a form of rescue. The card bore a single sentence in a hand I was certain belonged to the broken nose. Sin fama, quia notitia, est pestis ordinis. Without fame, because publicity is the plague of order. I slipped the card into my notebook and saw, too late, the tiny residue it shed grayish glitter that smelled like the ink alchemist's jars. Treasury ink had kissed even their aphorisms. I brushed my fingers together and breathed that smell again. Dried iron on parchment. The scent of patience weaponized. At the seam I paused and listened for the backward antiphon. Silence, not the human kind, the engineered kind. A stop, not a rest. I moved through the corridor as if it were a throat, and I a word the sentence had decided not to need. The gate's guard glanced up for once and blinked at something he could not name in my face. Late night, Father? The title barely grazed me now, less because I had abandoned it than because it had let go of me like a boat slipping its knot when the tide decides. Long night, I said, which was true and not sufficient. In my room, the city's second-hand lights stitched bright lines under the curtains. I closed them anyway and set the recorder down on the table. I did not press play. I did not want to hear my own voice work so hard to be adequate to a machine that uses human beings as reagents. Instead, I opened the notebook and copied the 9 petal mottos around a crude drawing of the reservoir lip. Prudenter, recte, ordine, tempore, sine fama. I left the remaining petals blank. Perhaps they had no words. Perhaps the words appear only when a moon the color of stored wine obliges. Then I wrote the only sentence that felt both small enough to fit in my chest and large enough to trouble the hinges of that room. They have mistaken custody for care. It is an old mistake. It dresses as charity. It funds itself with the sort of oaths gentlemen admire. It teaches a choir to sing backwards so a city will forget the adjective on a memory and get on with its errands. It convinces the men in the circle that red light is merely a convenience and blood merely an index, and if you wish to pity them you could, for the most dangerous prisons are never the ones with keys. I slept and did not. When dreams came, they were bureaucratic. A calendar persuading a harvest to move. A map asking me whether I preferred my childhood park 1 finger width east. A choir correcting my heartbeat until the recording inside my chest ran at a speed the room preferred. I woke with a word on my tongue I had not used in 20 years and did not intend to again. The word was obedience, and it tasted like pages turned by gloved hands. Tomorrow would ask for more than watching. The oath had declared its appetite. The city, in its gentle way, would pay in seconds and in souls, and I would have to decide whether to remain an accountant for a theology of smoothness or to inconvenience a ledger designed to equate quiet with peace. If you are listening to me in the soft hour between waking and sleep, consider this the one instruction that is not a sermon. Keep friction. A page that refuses to lie perfectly flat is not an enemy of reading. It is a witness. The moon had paled. The aperture, far below me now, had returned to being an architectural absence. But the room remembers, as rooms do, and the blood remembers, as blood does. And the men who pressed their rings into warm resin will wake to find their consciences appropriately domesticated for the day. I rose and washed my hands, and, on the towel, the familiar smell rose and refused to dissipate. Dried iron on parchment. I laughed, softly and not kindly, and said to the empty air the only prayer I still believe in. Let memory rule time again. Then I put on my coat, slipped the stolen card behind a photograph of a river I had not seen since childhood, and chose to walk into a morning that had been curated in a chamber below my feet, knowing that the only honest thing I could carry into it was the grit of refusal. The summons arrived on a slip of paper that pretended to be an ordinary memo. No seal, no signature, no injunction in Latin to gird the conscience. 4 words in a hand that trusted its own smallness. Audit, portico. 2:14. Gloves. Audit, never confession, never correction, never penance. Audit is the word you use when you want to be righteous without heat. The city's night had already learned the new calendar by the time I reached the gate. Bells had rung their curated hour, and men had turned in with the obedience of old capitals. The guard nodded at me with that professional amnesia he wore like a badge. The key ring felt heavier, but perhaps it was my hand that understood weight differently now. The hinge accepted me no romance left in our meetings. Only habit and the red twilight met my eyes like a colleague you can't bear but understand too well. Tonight, the undercroft did not bother with the dignity of slow prelude. The tuning fork was already singing towards C. The bones in their resin hummed their small agreement. The ink slept in public jars and woke in private ones, and somewhere beyond the map, the silent office was pouring the reverse antiphon into the walls like breath into glass. Even the corridor smelled warmer, as if the stone had been convinced to blush. Rooms have circulations. Tonight's circulation had purpose. They were gathered at the map when I reached the aisle's mouth. Not as 9, yet that circle would convene in the chalice room, but as the necessary hands. The gaunt man with the broken nose, the choir leader with his precise wrists, 2 ink alchemists in aprons as ceremonial as any cope, a surveyor in a gray suit whose shoes read like a confession of walking more basements than boulevards, and the youngest, his bandage replaced with a neat, adhesive strip that made his thumb look briefly like an infant's, soft, honored, trained. On the table beside them lay the portfolio of vellum layers like the growth rings of a felled tree. The gaunt man set his hand on top, as if it were an obedient animal, and exhaled with the satisfaction of a craftsman who has already solved the problem and needs only the time to demonstrate it. 2 adjustments, he said, and from the way the choir leader lifted his chin, I learned the word's true grammar. To adjust is to obey a truth no one else is allowed to see. The surveyor unrolled the first layer and pinned it with the brass insects. It was a river, thin and self-important, sliding between baskets of inked hills toward a city that had grown fat on its banks. I knew the city not because I had lived there, but because everyone who studies maps learns the charisma of certain bends. On the margin, a notation in the ledger's unruffled hand. Treaty line ambiguous. Floodplain after last year's weather invites revision. Reassign monastery lands to Diocese A, to align with port rights. Public reason, maintenance after damages. A good lie wears overalls. Beside the river layer, the portfolio produced another sheet, a calendar wedge familiar now, a season cut like pastry and ready to be slid under the year's crust. The rubric, Harvest Vigil to be advanced by 1 feria, catechetical memorandum to emphasize prudence in scarcity, remove minor octave, add ferial day for reconciliation. Small moves, keystones, disguised as pebbles. The gaunt man did what men like him do when they have earned faith in their method. He taught while he proceeded. We're not moving the river, he said, eyes on the surveyor's hands. We're moving the story the river tells about the land. He lifted the stylus and hovered it above the vellum. Water listens to gravity. People listen to calendars. It was the neatest summary of statecraft I had ever heard, and it made me want to throw the stylus into the reservoir and watch the capillaries panic. The choir leader's wrist dipped. The reverse chant adjusted a breath. If you have ever watched a surgeon nod at an anesthetist, you know the intimacy of that small motion. We are such careful animals when we mean to harm without noise. Begin audit, said the gaunt man. The surveyor placed 3 new pins, not where the river ran, but where the river could be said to run if a flood's memory were persuaded to occupy more space than its water had. The first pin touched the page, and the capillary in the reservoir blushed its delicate grape skin blush. The second pin came down and a pressure tightened invisibly between my molars. The third pin slid a 1/4 inch east, and the taste in my mouth went briefly wrong. Not metal, not salt, not blood. Something like a word that decides mid-syllable to be foreign. My private life, that small, unsanctioned ledger, paid the fee. I misremembered the color of the bicycle I had ridden as a child. Yellow replaced blue with the carefree finality of a magician's scarf. I recovered it after a minute, forcing the truth back into place like a book into a shelf already crowded, and I understood, with a steadiness that frightened me, that the financing had begun. Edits must be financed. Every time the stylus touched, someone somewhere would shrug and accept that a fact had always been otherwise. Memory is elastic. Elastic snaps. "Mark," said the gaunt man, and the youngest did, his small flourish tamed to a dutiful tick. The ink alchemist leaned and painted a hair-thin darkness along the adjusted bank. The vellum drank obediently. The river agreed to tell a different story about jurisdiction. A monastery's kitchen would wake in a new diocese. A sheriff would discover that his authority ended where he had once flirted with merchants. A relic would belong, retroactively, to a different saint. Public notice. Maintenance after damages. They were efficient. When a system believes itself merciful, it moves without gloating. The rivers lie fixed. The calendar wedge came next. A whisper of an extra-ferial day would be inserted between a vigil and its feast, a shiver in the spine of a populace that would manifest as nothing more dramatic than mood. The gaunt man traced the wheel with his stylus, nicking time the way a cobbler nicks leather to make a shoe fit. The choir leader's fingers twitched. The reverse antiphon gained a quiet lilt, like a mother counting a child down to sleep. The tuning fork's needle steadied. Bones at sea hummed like a purr beneath the floorboards. I felt the city above rearrange 100 small errands. Bakers would rise a half-hour early, with the conviction that their fathers always had. A school would read a chapter one day sooner, and a boy who would someday write a poem that mattered would be elsewhere, learning a different adjective. There is no such thing as a minor octave when history has learned to do math. Then came the third layer, and with it, the conviction that this audit had not been assembled merely to tidy. The surveyor's hands slowed as he unrolled it. The vellum had been oiled and handled until it wore the patina of an heirloom knife. It was the coast, not of a city, but of a century, a broad cartouche that did not trace land and water so much as the reputations of both. In one corner, a long, pale scar ran across a peninsula like an old war that had learned to be landscape. The margin note refused drama. Historical reconciliation, adjust coastal survey to match astronomical tables, correct battle site designation, reassign national memory accordingly, public reason, archival error, discovered in foreign chart. I had read about the phantom time hypothesis at university in a seminar where skeptical men smirked behind beards. We love the theory because it flatters our modernity. If time can be counterfeited, then we must be clever to suspect it. But counterfeit needs a treasury, a press, a mint, an oath. Tonight, I watched the mint at work, not by inventing a century. No, those fantasies are for bulletin boards and men who shout. By moving a few hinge days and a few hinge miles until anniversaries bent and believers lined up at different doors. "Proceed," said the gaunt man. The choir leader did something I had not seen before. He lifted both hands, and the reverse antiphon split into two lines, sung in crisscross, like two barbers pulling a thread through a single stubborn hair. The room tightened. The capillaries brightened a perceptible degree, as if excited to be given real work after weeks of housekeeping. The tuning fork's needle flirted with R reconciliation before settling back to C. Bone frequencies thickened the air, until speech would have been impolite even to yourself. The stylus descended. The line along the coast adjusted. Not far, no man with a boat would capsize in surprise tomorrow, but far enough that a battle, memorialized in stone, would now lie just to the east of where the stones could be found. A country that has learned to be proud of stones is easy to persuade. Stones don't answer questions. The youngest watched the stylus lay this trope across a century, and did not flinch. His training had already eaten the part of him that flinches. The ink alchemist followed, laying a filament of treasury darkness that would deepen under the right hands and fade under the wrong. And then I forgot a face, not a name or a date, not a bicycle's color a face. My maternal grandfather's face, which had been as familiar to me as the slope of my own knuckles, slipped. I could arrange his features like a forensic artist. I could list high cheekbones, the left eye that watered in cold wind, the scar that was legend and not quite true, but the warmth, the weight of the face, the felt geometry that had taught my mouth how to form grief that was gone. It came back as if from another man's house. It did not fit the frame of my remembering. I sat down without meaning to, an obedient animal before a new rule of physics. The gaunt man did not notice me. I was not meant to exist. But the youngest, luckless enough in his youth to still notice peripheral suffering, glanced and then looked away in the way a man learns to look away if he wants to keep the job that pays his idea of meaning. The room had no sympathy to spare. Sympathy is an unbudgeted expense. The audit continued. The coastal correction demanded its natural twin, the repagination of a chronicle. An assistant brought out a book as tall as a child and laid it on a stand. Its title page had been erased with professional tenderness and replaced with one that looked precisely like itself. On the page, the gaunt man indicated were the year headings that mattered, the hinge years, where a minor shift could move festivals, coronations, epidemics, consecrations. He touched the number with the stylus. The choir leader rolled 2 fingers, and the retrograde chant accelerated half the width of a heartbeat. The bone frequency climbed the stair by 1 step and sat, polite and heavy, in the back of my teeth. The number did not change. The ink around it decided to mean something else. That is the last lesson they teach you down there, if you are stubborn enough to learn. You do not need to replace the statue if you can change the plaque. A dozen parishes would discover they had always celebrated a solemnity on a different day. A nun's diary, copied by her community into their calendar after she died, would be explained as a precious error. A city's flood, which had occurred on a feast and thus acquired a legend that made its politics inconvenient, would be remembered as having occurred on a weekday that kept business simple. Small edits, large financing. I understood then why the reservoir had a throat and not a surface. This was no table for meals or for reading. This was an intake, a lung. The capillaries pulsed with the new anemia of a world that hadn't bled yet and already missed something. Each pulse felt like the cough of a well-tuned engine. Under our feet, a pump distributed the night's decisions to the rooms designed to respond. The chained ledgers, the public copies that would lighten by a half shade under a certain lamp, the schoolroom manuals that would receive a new line under the old line and loyal children to read it. They moved to the final sheet. I had not seen anything like it. Not a map, not a calendar. Something between a genealogical chart and a wiring diagram. threads of office and influence crossing centuries with the arrogance of ivy. Names I recognized slid past names I had never heard and never would. Abbots, archivists, accountants, printers, cantors, magistrates, one astronomer whose star charts had been bought for a song and then buried under songs. At two junctions the threads bled, small red dots painted in with a stingy hand. The gaunt man tapped the first dot. "Remove the octave," he said, and the choir inhaled in its backwards way. He tapped the second. "Unmake the saint." The words were not theological, they were administrative. It is always easier to be calm when you are sure you will never be examined. The youngest began to tremble. It was so small a trembling that only someone who has loved a trembler would recognize it. He stared at the red dots as if they were coals in a grate. The gaunt man did not watch him. He placed the stylus where it needed to go. The ink alchemist set her brush the way a nurse sets a needle beside a vein. The choir leader made his micro-blessing, and the room, tuned and saturated and prepared like an operating theater, did what it was designed to do. It made obedience easy and regret expensive. The brush touched. A winter river in a northern country lost its rumor of a miracle and became an ordinary ice. A woman whose bones had gathered private veneration would continue to be loved by the same people, and yet the love would have no liturgical chair to sit on. It would be tolerated in a corner until it learned to starve politely. A painting begun under the lean blue of late harvest would be finished under a bruised red 2 weeks later, and the patron would declare the red more devout, and a younger painter watching would learn to distrust blue for 20 years, and a color in a century would miss its hour. The edit hurt, not with spectacle, with arithmetic. And in my mouth another rung came out of my ladder. Not a face this time, not a name, a direction. The confidence that east is where I have believed east to be since childhood, since the first time I placed my finger on a school map and thought, as every child thinks, that the world is legible tilted. For 5 heartbeats, I did not know where I would find sunrise. The feeling left me like a fever leaving. It took with it a shred of stubbornness I had relied on all my life. The stubbornness that tells a man that if he can name the cardinal points, he cannot be lost. I was not lost, and yet I felt the friction of being located by someone else's hand. The youngest made a sound, not a protest, never that. A sound like a man finding out that the lever he's been allowed to pull is attached to himself. He did not stop the brush. He could not. You do not stop a ritual once the tuning is correct. That is the first rule of both surgery and theater. He closed his eyes, and in the red light he looked what he was trained to forget. Very young. "Seal," said the gaunt man, "because sentences must end even when they should not have begun. Rings found warm resin, spirals took. The tuning fork's needle eased a fraction toward L, the liturgical day returning, like a field waking after being rolled. The capillaries dimmed, satisfied. The choir unbraided its double line and finished on its cancellation, as if the room had never needed song. Bones rested, ink lids closed. The night learned itself again. For a long breath nobody moved. Then the cleanup began, brisk and quiet. The vellum was rolled, the brass insects unpinned, the portfolio restrapped, the notes collected, the card with sine fama tucked back into a pocket. The youngest touched his adhesive strip, as if it were talisman enough to keep a thumb from learning too much about its own complicity. The gaunt man murmured something to the surveyor that sounded like gratitude in a language that had forgotten how to thank. The choir leader checked the fork, wrote C69 on a card, and slipped it into a file that would be filed in a room, that would be filed in a system that calls its drawers care. I remained where I was, because leaving would have been a discourtesy to the broken ladder in my chest. The map plate, temporarily naked without its layers, showed the wall's old scars, places where past pins had once sat before being coaxed to forget. You can tell history by where it has been sanded. This wall had learned to be smooth the way a liar learns to keep his face still. When I could stand, without needing to put a hand out for balance, I went to the silent office and touched the rim of the slate circle. The stone was warm. Does that comfort you? It should not. Warmth in the wrong object tells a story about labor rather than sanctuary. On the shelf, the antiphone ad retrorsum lay open to a page that had not been used tonight. In the margin, a note in a crabbed hand. When doubling the line, beware over-tuning. Excess retrograde produces anecdotal voids beyond acceptable ranges. Acceptable ranges, there it was again, mercy measured by a thermostat. Back in my room, I tried to draw my grandfather's face. I got the eye right on the third attempt, not because my memory had returned fully, but because the muscle of my hand refused to obey the new grammar. Hands are stubborn. They remember truths muscle down that the mouth can be persuaded to surrender. When I finished, the face looked like him after his second stroke kind, slightly astonished to still be alive, pleased by small slices of cake. This is how an edit pays its tax. It leaves you a version that can pass in conversation and steals the quality that makes conversation necessary. I played the recorder. My voice was smaller than the room. Audit, I heard myself whisper. River, calendar, coast, chronicle, genealogy, financing, color of bicycle, a face, east, capillary response proportional to hinge events. Choir doubled, fork at C69, bones a notch above ordinary obedience. Ink absorption schedule obeyed. Then, more quietly, because I did not want to hear it even from myself, they have mistaken custody for care again. But tonight I saw the prophet. Smoothness is its own addiction. Once you start, you will sand everything that catches a nail. I do not know what morning will look like from inside a city that just shifted by a finger width in its sleep. Likely the same. Buses, bread, women who have taught their children to kiss holy cards and to distrust statistics. Men who would make decent fathers if time were gentler. That is the cunning in the system's design. Consequences are distributed like dust everywhere, individually ignorable, collectively fatal to lungs. I slept a little. I dreamed a small, loyal dream. My grandfather teaching me to set a paper boat on a gutter after rain. In the dream, the boat moved faster than it should have, and the gutter ran east, not south. I woke with a laugh too sharp to belong in a bedroom, and said his name aloud, as if I could solder the face back to the syllables. It worked almost well enough, almost as the coin of this kingdom. Tomorrow, I will stop narrating like a man whose job is to describe weather. Tomorrow I will put my hands where the room does not want them, and see which hinge complains. If you are listening in your bed, if your phone screen has gone dark and you are letting this voice float in the velvet between wakefulness and the first good sleep you've had this week, hold one instruction under your tongue like a sacrament they never taught. When a map moves, Write down what left your mouth. The word you forgot, the taste that went wrong, the face that came back wearing a stranger's coat. Put it in a notebook you will not show anyone yet. Private ledgers ruin curated time. That is why they fear old women and their drawers of receipts more than they fear critics. The night the map moved, I paid with a direction and a face and a small confidence I had never known I loved. The city paid with a harbor, a hunger, a hymn. The men in the circle paid with nothing they could feel. The reservoir purred and slept. The hinge cooled. The wall learned to be smooth again. I rinsed my hands and watched the water run pink for a second, then honest. The smell on the towel rose and would not depart. Dried iron on parchment. I said, because a man has to keep a sentence alive if he intends to live. Silence isn't sacred, it's enforced. Then I dressed for morning, which would arrive on schedule, and I prepared to inconvenience a timetable. There is a time of night when the city stops pretending to be busy and remembers that it is only a collection of rooms asking to be forgiven for their walls. I had reached that time. The recorder's red eye slept. The curtain was a second darkness, drawn across the first. Somewhere below me, the undercroft arranged its capillaries in the posture bureaucracy loves, tidy, lubricated, satisfied. The oath lay cooling in the stone like a coin in a fountain nobody admits to throwing. The room had been tuned. The ink had been taught to deepen where it was wanted and politely fade where it would make a mess. The bones hummed at sea. The choir had spoken backward until the air held still long enough to accept a correction. It was over, the night said. Go to sleep. Instead, I sat at the table with the notebook open and arranged a small human resistance. Words. Not grand ones. Not the kind that get engraved into public stone and then sanded by the next committee. Small ones you can carry like a match in a pocket. I wrote the names of my dead. I wrote the dates they had taught me and the dates I had been ordered to forget. I wrote the street corners that no longer reached each other and the color of a bicycle I had wrestled back from a wrongness that wasn't mine. I wrote the map's finger width east. I wrote the sound the stylus makes when it decides to be gravity's accomplice. I wrote the smell dried iron on parchment because that smell had followed me like a patient animal, and because someday, when you are old and memory is a book with uneven margins, smell will be the last librarian willing to show you the uncatalogued shelf. I wrote one more thing, because I had not said it plainly yet, and because plainness is the only grammar that doesn't owe the ledger interest. Silence isn't sacred, it's enforced. If I ever forget the rest, if the ink in my pocket fades, and the recorder's tape snaps, and the men below bleach their ledgers with a cleaner grammar, let this sentence survive on the inside of my teeth. At 2:12, the city shifted its weight on the cot of its streets. A delivery truck exhaled. An ambulance rehearsed the sorrow it was about to borrow. A woman took a kettle off a stove with the certainty that water sings when it is loved. I rose and packed what a man without a plan calls a plan. Notebook, extra batteries, a stub pencil that could still sign a life if asked nicely. The card I had stolen, sign Fama tucked behind a photograph of a river whose direction my childhood knew without argument. I put on the coat whose lining remembered a recorder. I left the room to the dust it had been teaching itself all these years. You expect heroics here. I wanted them too. The story aches for a doorway where the whistleblower gathers an honest crowd and kicks the hinge until confessors pour into the red room and cameras capture a treaty remembering it is mortal. But rooms are older than uprisings. Doors do not break because you deserve it. And the men who tune calendars have long ago learned to build their hinges out of a material that looks like patience and is stronger than steel. This would not be the night of spectacular virtue. This would be the night of friction. Friction is smaller. It keeps you warm when the fuel is counted by someone who dislikes your mouth. At the gate, the guard knew what the hour meant as surely as the deacon had known where to put his finger between clauses. "Storm?" he asked, not looking up. In this city, every unslept man owes every other unslept man a weather report. "Wind," I said, because that is the word a liar uses when he plans to rearrange the air. The undercroft received me with its old courtesy, but the courtesy felt thinner, like silk that has been worn against a belt for too many seasons. I walked past the seam that had learned my hand and put the recorder into a listening posture. Not on, just there. Some nights want to be overheard without being recorded. There is a difference. The first is a promise to yourself. The second is a promise to a judge. I went first to the silent office. The circle of slate had cooled. The lamps stood like obedient pupils, with their faces to the wall. The book of antiphony ad retrorsum lay open to a mode that had not yet been poisoned. Its mirrored neumes gleamed with the confidence of an instrument that believes it has no opposite. I didn't touch it. Not because I feared superstition. My superstition had already been poorly treated and had learned to keep to itself, but because touching it would make me their kind of engineer. Instead, I stood at the circle's edge and spoke forward. I recited the ordinary nunc dimittis, the way I had learned to say it at bedsides, when the living lived and the dying learned how to leave them properly. Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace. The room did not like it. My breath made the air ripple the wrong way, upsetting the smoothness the backward chant had combed into the night. I thought of those mothers who run their hands against the grain of a sleeping child's hair on purpose, just to say, "You are not a field. You are not for mowing." I finished the canticle and added a second sentence in a voice more naked than prayer. "Let memory rule time." It wasn't a sermon. It was the smallest correction, a finger on a compass needle declaring north still exists. The instrument on the shelf, a tuning fork with its bottled scale, quivered toward L and returned to C, offended perhaps, or only surprised. I smiled at it, like a man who has pushed a bureaucrat's chair an inch skew in an empty office so that morning might feel wrong to a comfortable spine. Keep friction. One day they would find a raw place where their usual glove had expected polish. One day their finger would come away not with resin but with ink. In the room of ink, I stole nothing. The jars deserved better than sanctimony. But I rewrote a label with the stub of my pencil, not the ingredients, only the title. Thesaurus atramentum. I amended to Thesaurus atramentum, public hope, in a hand that would pass casual inspection, the way a cough passes as a laugh in a room where laughter is the expected offering. A small vandalism. Yes. What is the point, you ask? The point is that a novice might read it and, for one syllable of a day, hesitate before stirring a drop from the reservoir into the ink. Hesitation is the opposite of smoothness. It makes a mark you cannot erase with resin. We overestimate the drama of courage because it flatters the legend of villains. Most oaths are ruined by a pause. At the shelf of bones I did less. A fragment labeled R, 57, had been placed too near the edge of its tray. I moved it a thumb-breadth inward and said the name I had written 20 times, upstairs and underlined. My grandfather. Rooms don't hear names. Rooms remember positions, but bone hears bone. And I wanted, absurdly, and with the obstinacy of men who love the dead in ways that are not rational, to see whether a fragment shifted toward C could learn a new habit because someone pronounced a mouthful of syllables with love. The needle did not move. I did not expect it to. Not every lunge at physics earns applause. It was enough to leave the room with my mouth warmed. At the map, the wall's brass insects gleamed with the smugness of creatures that believe themselves a family heirloom. I could not move the plates. I would not. Your anger would have applauded it. Their order would have thanked me for the excuse to tidy loudly and blame a vandal. Instead, I wrote on my map paper stolen from a parish office that had stopped counting its sermons in ink years ago. I drew the harbor in both positions where it had been and where it had been invited to be, and wrote in simple language what I had watched. A finger-width east, public reason, maintenance after damages, private reason, pressure on jurisdiction, obedient calendar. I folded the paper and slid it behind a stack of hymnals in a church, where a janitor with a faithful mustache moves books with the reverence of a man building a fort he intends to defend. Someday a child will find it and ask a question so small a teacher will answer it, and thereby unteach a decade of careful hush. You see what I am doing. It is not a raid. It is a disappearing act, performed backward, restoring one item at a time from the magician's sleeve to the table. I am not a hero. I am a clerk, resigning from a ledger. Clerks know the power of error. A decimal moved ruins empires quieter than cannons do. A note in a margin saves a life, because it makes a reader unable to continue convincingly to the end of a lie. If you want to torpedo a ship, you can also open its valves a turn and walk away. In the chalice room, the aperture lay blind. The moon rinsed of its wine. Empty chairs waited. The reservoir's lip held the night like a held breath. I placed on the stone the card I had stolen, sign Fama, and beside it I added a second card I had cut from my notebook. The handwriting was mine. The sentence was not. It was older than me, older than the city, older than the undercroft's pretensions. Memoria Regit Tempus. Memory rules time. I left them together, the way a hospital nurse leaves a spoon beside the bitter medicine because the mouth deserves sweetness, even in institutions. The 9 will find them, or the assistant will. If they laugh, they will laugh, but something small will shift. A pulse will miscount. A gate will not close flush. A habit will take 2 extra seconds to don its ring, and the ring will cool enough to lose its easy impression. Friction. I will not tell you everything I did that night because a list makes a lie of density, and because your life will require your own list, not mine. The point of a story like this is not to furnish you with instructions. It is to hand you uses. My uses are small. I photocopied a page and mailed it to a seminarian who does not yet know he is brave. I wrote a letter to a librarian I trust and addressed it to her home instead of her office. I left an envelope, unsealed and courteous, on a bench where a tour guide eats the same sandwich every Thursday. Inside it, I placed a copy of a map with 2 coastlines and a note that said, "Only, which one do you tell? And why?" I called a woman who sings at a church where people still listen and said, "Teach one hymn backward to your choir not to sing it, only to learn how it feels, and then ask them which words the throat refuses." She laughed, then did it. then called me crying because it turns out singing backward makes memory paw at its collar, and because some words resist domestication even when mouths have been trained to obey. Then I came home and recorded this, not as evidence, yet evidence is for courts, and courts are for men who learn to do surgery with rhetoric, but as a torch. If you are listening in a room with a door, consider the hinge. If you are listening in a car, consider the map. If you are in bed, consider the calendar that will call you to work in the morning and ask whether it is the same calendar your grandmother kept. If you are falling asleep, and God knows I want you to sleep, because the undercroft feeds on fatigue, keep one corner of your mind awake, the same corner you kept awake when you were a child, and a door cracked and light spilled, and you learned that seeing is not a sin. Here is the part you asked me for without asking. The call to action, not a rally, not a march. Those have their uses, but they are too easy to photograph and therefore too easy to file under fame, and you know what the mottos say about that. I am asking for a quieter rebellion, the kind that starves a ledger of the food it eats. Keep a private calendar, not for appointments, for edits. When a news story arrives that fits too neatly, when a festival migrates without explanation, when a miracle is recatalogued as meteorology or a discovery is suddenly called a wonder, write the date and write one sentence about how your body felt reading it. Bodies know before minds give them permission. Archive your elders. Sit with the oldest mouth in your family, turn on a recorder, and ask for street names, feast days, flood years, the color of the painting that used to hang over the stove, the nickname of a priest whose real name nobody remembers. Put it on paper and in 2 places. The undercroft knows how to edit archives. It is baffled by grandmothers. Practice names that were removed. Find the saint who was erased, the scholar whose footnote went missing, the midwife whose ledger burned. Speak the names out loud when you make tea. They are wedges. A door that has learned to close cannot abide a name. Refuse smoothness. When a page lies perfectly flat, put your finger under the corner and lift. Ask a question that breaks the posture of consensus. When did that calendar change? Why does the map in this textbook not match the one in the museum? Who decided the miracle wasn't? The answer may be harmless. The habit is not. Write the wrong thing in the right place. A question in the margin of a hymn, a date on the inside of a coat, a street map drawn by a child and pinned to the door of a city office with a magnet shaped like a fruit. Institutions cannot forgive love notes to the truth. They cannot catalog them. They survive because they can catalog. Teach backward, not heresy, not sabotage. Teach a class to sing one line of music backward for the pleasure of discovering which syllables want to live. Then talk about wanting. Wanting is the enemy of curation. Keep receipts. Literally. Put them in a drawer by month. When the coast shifts a finger width, you will know because the groceries will insist on telling you an old truth with new numbers. Adopt a hinge. An anniversary, a boundary stone, a public clock, a plaque. Visit it. Photograph it in every season. If it moves, you will have proof, not for court, perhaps, but for your own refusal to be recounted against yourself. Tell children the old directions. East is where the window warmed your face when you were small and pretended to be a planet. If east migrates, you will suffer less because your child will say, "But that's not where east belongs," and the sentence will scuff the polish of a perfect ledger in a way statistics have never managed. Say no to an edit in your mouth. When you start to tell a story and hear yourself simplifying it because a room prefers smoothness, stop and begin again. Add the wrinkle, name the error, chew the word that makes you inconvenient. Notoriety is not required, only accuracy. This will not topple the chamber. It will do something better. It will inconvenience it. Rooms built to manage obedience are allergic to being seen. If enough of us practice seeing, they develop a rash. Rashes ruin meetings. Meetings are where maps move. You want me to tell you what happens to me next. I will, but you must accept that my next is not your next, and that stories are disobedient when they are told responsibly. I will not break into the undercroft and set fires. Fire is theatrical. It flatters the men with rings. They have plans for photographs of flames. I will stand where I am most dangerous to them, beside ordinary people with erasable lives, giving them pens that do not fade. I will cultivate a choir that sings forward, in kitchens and stairwells and buses, until the air remembers how to be unengineered. I will find the youngest again, not to recruit, not to condemn, but to ask the question that turns a colleague into a witness. What did it cost you the night the map moved? If he can answer, the ledger loses a page. If he cannot, a new name goes in my drawer of prayers. And to you, because you are in America or Europe or a place that thinks it is neither, but insists on speaking English with the accent of its own sleep. Here is the last sentence I have to place in your hands like a coin I need you to keep warm. Don't stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory returning. They cannot prosecute a man for remembering. They try, they fail, they sand. The grain grows back. Trees are stubborn. So are ledgers written in ordinary ink by men and women who sharpen pencils on the front steps because there is better light there than in the kitchen. I finished the notebook page and blew on it as if breath helps ink. Habit, uselessness disguised as care. Then I drew a small square at the top and filled it with a color I chose without allegory blue, the color that had been stolen from my bicycle for a minute and that I had fetched back like a dog called by a wrong name. Under it, I wrote 2:12, the hour where the room needed a witness, the hour where I found my spine. I closed the book. I placed it under the mattress as if I were 8, and believed coins sleep better under a body. I lay down. If you are nearly asleep, if this voice is a tide pulling your eyelids gentle, let it. Sleep is not their ally. Exhaustion is. Sleep the way a city sleeps when it knows its children will wake and ask a question at breakfast that has not been assigned. Keep your own time. Count your small edits. Write one sentence every day that resists an adjustment. Name one erased person. Move a bone, a thumb breadth inward by speaking love. Unsmooth one page. And if a door opens where no door should be, if the hinge breathes, and the air tastes like dried iron on parchment, do not go alone. Take a witness, take a pencil, take the song of an old woman who remembers which saints belonged to which windows. Take the word you refuse to edit. The room may still do what rooms do, but when it is finished and the capillaries cool and the men gather their rings, a sentence will remain in the air like a perfume that will not wash out. Memory rules time, not their memory. Yours, ours. The choir that sings forward. The recorder's red eye woke on its own. the way a faithful pet wakes when the house sighs. I pressed it with my thumb until it blinked out. The moon chased again, ordinary as a coin in a pocket, dragged its light across the floor, and for a second the line looked like a map's coastline, asking to be respected. I closed my eyes and made the miniature vow the night had wanted all along. I will not live by curated peace. I will live by remembered time. Then I slept, and the city, which had been edited into morning, rose around me, and a clock that had never loved me rang a faithful hour, and somewhere beneath it a room tuned itself and paused as if it had felt for the first time the grit I had left on its lip. Thinking,